So the T-bill might be, I don't know what a T-bill is today. 0.25. So you would go in with 0.25 plus a spread, and the spread would not be settled until financial close, at which time everyone can see your agreements. So you're correct, it's more of a share. Operating, demand risk to the public, service pricing to the public, labor disputes can be shared, change of political change environment shared. So you can see that it's not quite as simple as saying, you transfer everything. Delays, unforeseen events, relief events, force majeure, changes of law. So the government, and this template is what drives your price. So how then do you go the next step? And so here's what they do. They look at the base price. They multiply by the probability of it happening times the impact. So they go through an exercise. And so let's say that we're going to take design, coordination, and completion. So we have a design construction budget of $240 million. That would be risk-free. Then we go on the design, build, maintain model, and we say, what's the probability of this cost overrun happening? So it's it's 90%. What would be the impact on? And so they look at the they then look at that impact. You can see that in this case, the private sector is going to take that risk, and in the 10th percentile, it will be about a 0.5% premium. A typical would be a 1% premium, and in the case of it happening in the 90th percentile of risk, it would be 5%. If you notice here that there's nothing in the province and there's nothing in the chair. So, but if you look at the private side, at the public side, you find in fact that, again, you use the same probability to overrun, but all of it is then taken on the government side. So in the above example, for a 250 million project, the government would retain 4.3 million of design risk under the traditional model. And this goes into your value for money. So in other words, in this case, the private sector is taking all that risk of 4.3. And in this case, the government is taking the risk of 4.3. But the problem is that in this model, this developer has to take that risk and accept it, and they know the price. The government isn't going to add this to the budget. They're going to still say it's 240 million. And the developer is going to say, no, it's not 240. The probability of that happening is very high. And so we're going to have to be compensated for taking that risk. And so you find that in the public sector, most of these risks are assumed to have zero cost. And so empirical evidence shows that a much higher probability that risk will actually occur if there's no measure to manage and mitigate the risk. So what this does is it brings a transparency. And if you know anything about risk, risk has to be quantified. If you take out a life insurance policy, we have what we call actuarials that take demographic information and they determine the risk of you departing. And then they figure out what you're going to pay monthly for an insurance policy. Car companies, everyone who deals with risk has highly sophisticated models. It's interesting, the sort of grandfather of our bond market with the Royal Bank of Canada was an actuarial. And he said it was a tremendous asset for him to be able to price bonds because he could in fact calculate risk.
Hey Jim, can we go back there for a minute?
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand, in my mind, how this works. So you got 240 million
Yeah.
is the value of design and construction.
Yeah.
And that's essentially your cost base.
Yeah.
And then we're saying the probability of a cost overrun is 90%?
Yeah. Based on empirical evidence.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so the design build finance model then says the quantification of that risk based on the assumed probability and the impact, typically in this case at 1%, right? That's what you're using, I'm assuming. It's
Yeah,
effectively
1%.
0
Yeah.
and not 2.16 million, or you're assuming it's absorbed into the model?
Well, this is the impact that the private sector is dealing with. If you look at here, what we find is okay. It goes back to the point that Dan mentioned the other day. You know, the government. I mean, we would look at a 5% contingency on a project. Government would look at 15 or 20%.
Right.
Okay. So we find that what if you really say to government, you know, what is your cost overrun? They would likely say 2%. If you went to the private sector, they would likely say, you know, 1% is the industry norm.
Right, right. So again, go back to the quantification of the risk. I get that part of the traditional model. I guess in 4.3, right? And that's the share to zero because it's all assumed. I can't read very clearly. That's the province, the government, basically?
Yeah, in other words, the government has said we're not taking the risk and we're not even sharing the risk.
Okay.
So this cost is yours.
I'm
sorry, that risk is yours.
It's absorbed into the model. So
Yeah.
the risk quantification you're showing is just where the public is concerned or where there's shared risk.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm with you now.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And so here's a kind of summary of the risks. So on the design, build, finance, maintain model, here's the pricing, and here's the traditional model. So what this model is talking about is that the public, in this case, well, go to this one. The public in this case is really, there's about, a retained risk is about 76%. And in this model, they've washed themselves of a lot of that, and they're down to about a 16 to. So that means that for the risks the government retained under this model, they've got a risk base of about 16%. Under the traditional model, when I go back to the numbers of overrun, they've retained more than 75% of the risk. The problem here is they haven't priced any of this. So on a $100 million project, the province would retain 76 million of risk on a traditional procurement model, but only 16.2 on a DFM. I mean, it sounds crazy, but look at the numbers that I was showing you before. I'll give you an example. This particular project is an interesting one because the financial close was the day that the market crashed in November 2008, and Deutsche Bank walked after commercial close and right at the point of financial close. Deutsche Bank walked, and the project, they walked from a $5 million deposit, and it was a real dilemma. But if you're interested, I can send you these reports. There's a report on the methodology. There's a public report on this. But in this case, the value for money was about $96 million. So based on what I said yesterday, this was a traditional model. These were the calculations on the DBFM, and the argument was that there was about a $96 million savings based on that risk model. So here are the transferred risks. Construction price certainty, certainty of delivery. The government had no responsibility for site conditions and contamination. The developer took all those risks. The developer took the risk of all the development approvals, including construction permits. They took the risk for all the mechanical, electrical, all the construction financing, all the commissioning, all the activity protocols, all of the change order protocols, and all of the life cycle repair and renewal. All of those were transferred to the private developer. Yeah.
Now, what do you mean by change order protocol? What does that mean?
Oh, what they would have is, in their bid, they would agree to accept change orders according to, there would be a prescription as to what was a viable change order. So in other words, if it was something where the government wanted to move certain walls, and it was kind of cost neutral, they would do that. In other words, they were willing to look at some flexibility, but if the government said, oh, we want to go from LEED Gold to LEED Platinum, that would be a different matter. So what I mean by protocol was that there would be a setup of what changes the government could make at no cost. So
At no cost?
At no cost, yeah. Because in fairness, when you're building a hospital, there may be things that you've got to change. So there would be, if it could be, so it wasn't a case where, as you know, change orders in the public sector are famous, right? It's this plus